My husband's family insulted my mother right to her face at my own anniversary party, in front of all our wealthy guests. They laughed at her simple homemade dress, whispered that she did not belong in a place like this, and literally told her to go sit quietly in the corner of the kitchen. I watched my mother lower her eyes, pretending not to hear a single word they said just to protect my reputation. But I refused to let them break her. So I calmly walked over to the DJ booth, took the microphone, and made a financial announcement that completely ruined my husband's toxic family and cost them everything they owned. Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had to stand up to toxic in-laws who underestimated your worth and tried to make you feel small. My name is Nia, and I am 34 years old. I am the founder and CEO of a highly successful financial technology platform. I built my wealth from the ground up, working late nights and sacrificing everything to turn my vision into reality. But you would never know that by listening to my mother-in-law Vivian or my white sister-in-law Chloe. They walked around acting like they were the elite royalty of Atlanta while secretly drowning in massive debt. My husband Marcus was a corporate investment banker who always turned a blind eye to his family's cruel behavior because he was too obsessed with maintaining his false image. Growing up, my life was the exact opposite of Marcus. His family prided themselves on being part of the old money black elite of the city. They were obsessed with country club memberships, Greek letter organizations, and dropping the right names in every conversation. They looked down on anyone who actually had to work with their hands. My mother, Miss Shirley, is a 62-year-old retired hospital janitor. She spent her entire life doing grueling manual labor, scrubbing floors and cleaning bedpans, just so I could have money for coding camps and college tuition. She is the most selfless, hardworking woman on the planet, and she is the sole reason I am where I am today. The nightmare started last month during my 5th wedding anniversary party. I decided to host a massive celebration at our sprawling penthouse in Buckhead. I wanted it to be perfect. The entire place was decorated with imported white roses and crystal chandeliers hanging from the high ceilings. A live jazz band was playing softly in the background while waiters walked around serving expensive champagne and fancy appetizers. It was a room filled with high society socialites, business tycoons, and local politicians. Everyone was dressed in custom-tailored tuxedos and designer gowns that cost more than a brand-new car. The air smelled of expensive perfume and the clinking of crystal glasses echoed through the room. I was standing near the main bar talking to a group of my top investors, pretending to listen to their golf stories. Out of the corner of my eye, I saw the heavy oak double doors of the penthouse open. My mother walked in. She had refused my offer to send a private car, saying she preferred to take a cab. She is a simple, humble woman who never cared about luxury brands or showing off. For my special night, she had stayed up late sewing her own dress. It was a modest floral print, knee-length dress that probably cost her $50 in fabric. She carried a small, worn-out leather purse that she had owned for at least 10 years. She looked so proud and so genuinely happy just to be there to celebrate my success. But the moment she stepped into that grand living room, the entire energy shifted. I watched from a distance as the wealthy guests stopped their conversations and turned to stare at her. The whispering started almost immediately. Women dripping in diamonds gave her those subtle, condescending up and down looks. They judged her worn-out shoes and her inexpensive handbag. The tension in the room grew thick and heavy with unsaid microaggressions. You could feel the silent judgment radiating from the crowd. My mother stood near the entrance, clutching her purse nervously, clearly realizing that she was the only person there who did not look like a millionaire. The bright, excited smile on her face slowly started to fade as she noticed the stares. I immediately excused myself from the investors and started walking toward her. I wanted to welcome her, give her a huge hug, and make her feel like the queen she truly was to me. I wanted to show everyone in that room that I was incredibly proud of the woman who raised me. But the crowd was thick, and I had to weave my way through groups of talking people, apologizing as I bumped into shoulders and elbows. Before I could reach her, I saw Vivian and Chloe detach themselves from a group of local politicians. They zeroed in on my mother like predators spotting a vulnerable target in the wild. Vivian was wearing a ridiculous emerald green sequined gown that she definitely could not afford. She held her glass of champagne close to her chest, her face twisted into a look of absolute snobbish disgust. Chloe was right beside her with her perfectly blown-out blonde hair and that fake sympathetic smile she always wore when she was about to say something incredibly insulting. They moved directly into my mother's path, completely blocking her from entering the main party area. I tried to walk faster, pushing past a waiter carrying a silver tray of caviar. My heart started to race because I knew exactly how cruel those two women could be. I could see my mother trying to smile politely at them, but her hands were trembling. She had sacrificed everything for me, and now she was standing in my home being treated like an unwanted intruder by the very people who were secretly living off my hard-earned money. I took a deep breath and braced myself for the confrontation that I knew was about to change our lives forever. Before I unleashed my wrath on Vivian and Chloe, I needed to know exactly where my husband stood. Marcus and I had been married for 5 years. We stood at an altar in front of 200 people and took vows to protect each other, to stand by each other through thick and thin. He always claimed he was entirely different from his pretentious family. He always whispered in my ear late at night that he respected my mother and deeply admired everything she had sacrificed to give me a chance at a better life. This was his moment to prove those late-night whispers were actually true. This was his ultimate chance to walk across that polished marble floor, put his arm firmly around the woman who gave birth to his wife, and tell his mother and sister-in-law to back off and show some basic human respect. I slowly turned my head, scanning the crowded, brilliantly lit ballroom, until my eyes locked onto his tall figure. He was standing near the towering champagne pyramid, holding a crystal glass halfway to his mouth. He looked like the picture-perfect image of success, wearing a custom-tailored velvet tuxedo that I had secretly paid for. He was surrounded by 3 senior partners from his investment banking firm. These were men he constantly tried to impress, men he desperately wanted to invite him to their exclusive weekend golf retreats. Our eyes met across the room. The distance between us was maybe 20 feet, but it suddenly felt like a massive, uncrossable canyon. I know he saw me. I know he clearly saw the tears shimmering in my mother's eyes, and he definitely saw the vicious, arrogant smirks plastered across the faces of his mother and Chloe. For one brief, agonizing second, the bustling noise of the anniversary party completely vanished from my mind. The jazz music, the clinking glasses, the polite elite chatter all faded into absolute silence. It was just me staring directly at the man I loved, waiting for him to drop his expensive drink, excuse himself from his colleagues, and rush to my side. I gave him a look that pleaded with him to do the right thing. I silently begged him to step up and be the strong, protective man I thought I had married. But Marcus did not move a single inch toward me. Instead, I watched as a flash of profound, intense embarrassment washed over his perfectly groomed face. He did not look embarrassed by his family's cruel, toxic behavior. He looked embarrassed by my mother. He looked embarrassed that the sweet, humble woman in the handmade $50 dress was standing in the middle of his high society networking event, dragging down his carefully constructed elite aesthetic. I could see the panic in his eyes as he realized the senior partners might notice the commotion and associate him with the poor black woman being publicly humiliated. Then he did the absolute unforgivable. He broke eye contact with me. He deliberately turned his back to us, shifting his body weight to fully face the senior partners. I watched his shoulders shake as he let out a loud, booming laugh at whatever joke one of the older men had just told. He took a long, slow sip of his champagne, completely erasing us from his reality. He actively chose his precious social climbing over my mother's basic human dignity. He chose his fragile ego over his own wife's breaking heart. That deliberate turn of his back hit me harder than a physical punch to the stomach. It felt like the solid floor had suddenly dropped out from underneath my expensive heels. My breath caught sharply in my throat, and a cold, hollow sensation spread rapidly through my chest, freezing the blood in my veins. For 5 entire years, I had convinced myself that Marcus was simply a helpless victim of his toxic family dynamic. I had made endless, pathetic excuses for his passive behavior. I told myself he was just trying to keep the peace to avoid unnecessary drama. I told myself he secretly hated their snobbish behavior, but just did not know how to firmly stand up to them. But seeing him laugh with those arrogant bankers, while my mother stood there trembling in shame, completely shattered every illusion I had ever held about my marriage. He was not a victim at all. He was a willing, enthusiastic participant. He was a weak, pathetic coward who valued the conditional approval of old money snobs over the heart of the woman who financed his entire lavish lifestyle. Every time he told me he loved me, every time he kissed my forehead and told me we were an unstoppable team, it was all a perfectly executed manipulation. He loved what my money could buy him, but he was fundamentally ashamed of where I came from. The pain of the sister-in-law rivalry, the sharp sting of Vivian and her constant daily microaggressions, all of that instantly faded into the background. This was no longer just a story about dealing with toxic in-laws. This was a massive, catastrophic marital fracture. The foundation of our entire life together cracked right down the middle and crumbled into dust in that exact moment. My mother squeezed my hand again, softly urging me to just let it go and walk away, but my mind was spinning with a terrifying, brilliant new clarity. I could easily destroy Vivian and Chloe right then and there in front of everyone. But Marcus was the ultimate betrayal. He was the enemy sleeping comfortably in my bed. I needed to look him in the eye completely away from his little audience of bankers. I needed to hear the pathetic, cowardly excuses fall directly from his own lips before I burned his entire fake world to the ground. I gently let go of my mother's hand and told her to wait for me by the quiet garden doors. I turned away from the sneering, triumphant faces of my in-laws and began walking straight toward my husband. The time for being the quiet, supportive wife was officially over. I marched directly toward Marcus, my high heels hitting the floor with dangerous precision. As I approached his little circle of bankers, he caught my eye and his smile instantly tightened. Before he could turn away again or pretend he needed another drink, I reached out and clamped my hand firmly around his velvet sleeve. I did not care how it looked to his colleagues. I smiled, a completely fake, tight-lipped smile at the senior partners, apologized for interrupting, and told them I needed to borrow my husband for a brief moment. Marcus tried to resist planting his feet, but my grip was like iron. I practically dragged him away from the champagne pyramid and pulled him down the long hallway toward my private home office. I shoved the heavy mahogany double doors open, pushed him inside, and locked the doors behind us. The heavy wood instantly cut off the jazz music and the loud chatter from the party, leaving us in a tense, suffocating silence. This office was my sanctuary. It was lined with custom bookshelves filled with business awards I had won and framed patents for the software I had built from scratch. It was a room that screamed self-made success. Yet Marcus stood in the center of my hard-earned space, adjusting his jacket with a scowl of pure annoyance on his face. He did not look guilty. He looked profoundly inconvenienced by my presence. "What is wrong with you?" he snapped, his voice sharp and highly defensive. "I was right in the middle of closing a massive potential deal with the managing director, and you just dragged me away like a disobedient child. You are completely embarrassing me, Nia, in front of the most important people in this city." I stared at him, feeling a toxic mixture of absolute disgust and pure disbelief. "I am embarrassing you," I fired back, my voice shaking with raw, unfiltered rage. "Your mother and Chloe just publicly humiliated my mother in front of hundreds of people. They told her she looked like a maid and explicitly ordered her to go sit in the corner of the kitchen. And you stood there, laughed with your banking friends, and literally turned your back on us. How could you be such a miserable, spineless coward?" Marcus rolled his eyes, letting out a loud, exaggerated sigh, as if I was being completely irrational and hysterical. "Oh, please, Nia, do not start this ghetto drama right now," he groaned, leaning back against my expensive leather desk. "They were just making a light-hearted joke." Your mother is way too sensitive and you are overreacting as usual. And honestly, you need to look at this from a logical perspective. We are hosting the absolute elite of Atlanta tonight. My family has a certain elite social standard to uphold. Your mother walked in wearing a cheap handmade dress, holding a purse that looks like it was dug out of a thrift store bin. She sticks out. She makes important people uncomfortable just by standing there. My jaw dropped. The man I had slept next to for 5 long years was standing in my house, telling me that the woman who sacrificed her entire life for me was an embarrassing inconvenience. I took a step closer to him, my hands balled into tight white-knuckled fists. My mother scrubbed hospital floors until her knees bled, so I could build the tech company that pays for the very velvet tuxedo you are wearing right now. I warned, my tone dropping to a dangerous, icy whisper. Do not you ever speak about her like that again. You have no real standard, Marcus. You have nothing but fake borrowed pride. Marcus' face turned a deep shade of red with sudden explosive anger. He absolutely hated when I reminded him of our true financial reality. He aggressively pointed his finger directly at my face. You need to drop this defensive, ungrateful attitude right now, he demanded, his voice rising to a shout. You have always had this massive chip on your shoulder about my family's generational wealth. You think just because you got lucky with a little tech startup that you understand how high society actually works. You do not. My family comes from a legacy of Black excellence. We have generations of prestige and social capital that your new money can never buy. You need to learn how to assimilate and respect your betters. He paced across the thick Persian rug, running his hands through his perfectly groomed hair, trying to regain his composed aristocratic facade. I need you to fix your face. Go back out into that ballroom, apologize to my mother for your aggressive behavior, and keep your mother completely out of sight for the rest of the night. Send her home if you have to. This anniversary party has to go absolutely perfectly, Nia. You cannot ruin this crucial night for me. I let out a harsh, bitter laugh that echoed off the mahogany walls. I cannot ruin this for you. Ruin what exactly, Marcus? You are standing in a $12 million house that I completely own, drinking imported champagne that I paid for, surrounded by powerful people who are only attending because of my corporate connections. What exactly are you so desperately afraid I am going to ruin? Marcus stopped pacing and looked at me with a sickening mixture of desperation and supreme condescension. Because Mother Vivian is about to make a major announcement to the entire ballroom, he said, his voice laced with arrogant, unshakable pride. She is finally opening up the family trust fund. She is going to publicly announce a massive multi-million-dollar capital injection into my new independent investment firm. This is my chance to step out of the shadows of the bank and be a major player in the financial world. If you start a petty, childish fight with her right now, you will jeopardize my entire future and the legacy of our marriage. Do not ruin this family trust fund announcement, Nia. I am warning you. The temperature in the room seemed to plummet instantly. I stared at his smug, expectant face, trying to process the absolute absurdity of the delusion he was currently living in. The intense burning anger in my chest was suddenly replaced by a sharp, chilling wave of confusion and pity. I slowly shook my head, my mind racing through the mountains of highly confidential financial documents I had meticulously gathered and secured in the hidden wall safe just a few feet away from where we were standing. I knew exactly what his mother was planning, and I knew exactly how fake it all was. I looked him dead in the eye, my voice completely devoid of any emotion, barely above a whisper. What trust fund, Marcus? Your family is completely broke. Marcus stared at me as if I had suddenly started speaking a foreign language. He blinked twice, his mouth opening and closing, before he let out a nervous, dismissive scoff. He told me I was losing my mind, and that my jealousy of his family's legacy was making me delusional. I did not even waste my breath trying to explain the reality of his financial ruin to him. He was too deeply embedded in his own fantasy world to understand the magnitude of what I knew. Without another word, I turned around, unlocked the heavy mahogany doors, and walked right out, leaving him standing alone in my office. I walked back down the long hallway, taking slow, deep breaths to steady my racing heart. The upbeat tempo of the live jazz band slowly filled my ears again, replacing the suffocating silence of the study. I needed to find my mother. I needed to make sure she was safe and untouched by these vipers before I enacted my final plan. As I stepped back out into the grand ballroom, the blinding lights of the crystal chandeliers momentarily disoriented me. I scanned the sea of expensive tuxedos and flowing gowns looking for the familiar floral print of my mother's handmade dress. But before I could even take 5 steps into the main room, my path was abruptly cut off. Trey and Chloe stepped right in front of me, moving with perfectly synchronized malice. Trey was Marcus' older brother, and he was just as arrogant, but with half the intelligence. He was wearing a flashy maroon suit that screamed for attention, holding a glass of scotch with a smug expression permanently glued to his face. Chloe leaned against him, holding her champagne glass delicately, her blue eyes sparkling with toxic amusement. They had intentionally positioned themselves to trap me between a massive marble pillar and the bustling dessert table. "Well, look who finally decided to rejoin the civilized world," Chloe said, her voice dripping with fake sweetness. "We were starting to wonder if you got lost in your own house, Nia, or maybe you were just in the back trying to calm down your mother." She seemed a little overwhelmed by all this elegance. I took a deep breath, forcing myself to keep my face completely blank. "My mother is perfectly fine, Chloe," I replied, my voice steady and cold. "She is just not used to being surrounded by people who lack basic manners." Chloe let out a high-pitched giggle that sounded like nails on a chalkboard. "Oh, Nia, do not be so defensive," she purred, reaching out to casually inspect a strand of my hair. "I love what you did with your hair tonight, by the way. Is it new? It looks so exotic. You know I always admire how you people can just change your whole look overnight. It must be so convenient not having to wash it every day." I felt a muscle feather in my jaw. The sheer audacity of her standing in my home, throwing out racist microaggressions wrapped in thinly veiled compliments was astounding. Trey chuckled, taking a sip of his scotch. "Relax, Chloe," he said lazily, waving his hand. "You know Nia gets a little aggressive when she feels intimidated. We have to be gentle with her. It is a big adjustment moving from her background into our social circle. She is still learning how to fit in." "Intimidated," I repeated, letting the word roll off my tongue with a heavy dose of sarcasm. "Trey, what exactly would I be intimidated by? Your failing startup company that just lost its third major investor this quarter. Or maybe I should be intimidated by the fact that your credit card was loudly declined at the country club last weekend. I heard the waiter had to ask you to step aside because you were holding up the line." Trey's smug smile instantly vanished, completely wiped from his face. His jaw tightened, and he looked around nervously to see if anyone nearby had heard my comment. Chloe immediately dropped her fake sweet persona, her blue eyes narrowing into venomous slits. "You have a lot of nerve speaking to my husband that way," Chloe hissed, stepping closer to me. "You might have some new tech money, Nia, but you will never have our class. You and your mother are exactly the same. You can dress yourselves up and buy big houses, but underneath it all, you are just loud, angry women trying to desperately climb a ladder you do not belong on." Mother Vivian is about to remind everyone exactly who the real elite are tonight. Chloe sighed dramatically, resting her hand on Trey's chest, trying to regain her composure. "You know, Nia, we actually feel sorry for you," she continued, her tone shifting into mock pity. "It must be exhausting having to constantly prove you deserve to be in these rooms. Trey was just telling me how much pressure Marcus is under, having to constantly coach you on proper etiquette. And honestly, we were all quite shocked when you invited your mother. I mean, it is wonderful that you are so loyal to your roots, but bringing her to an event like this, it is just a bit tone-deaf, do not you think? People are starting to ask questions. They are wondering if your tech company is really as successful as you claim, or if it is just a product of all those diversity grants they are handing out these days." I stared at her, letting the sheer ignorance of her words hang in the air. Diversity grants. I built my company in a tiny apartment while working 3 jobs. I coded the entire beta platform myself. I secured millions in venture capital through sheer brilliance and relentless hard work. And here was this talentless woman whose biggest accomplishment was marrying a man who was living off his mother's empty promises, trying to diminish my entire existence. I took a half step forward, invading her personal space the exact way she had invaded my mother's earlier. "Let me make something incredibly clear to you, Chloe," I said, my voice dropping to a low, steady octave that carried a deadly weight. "I do not need coaching on etiquette from a family that considers screaming at retail workers a hobby, and I certainly do not need business advice from a woman whose boutique has been operating at a massive loss for 2 consecutive years. The only reason people are looking at my mother tonight is because she is the only person in this entire room with genuine grace. You can wear all the designer clothes you want, Chloe, but your insecurity is incredibly loud." Chloe physically recoiled, taking a step back until she bumped into Trey. Her face flushed a furious shade of pink. She let out a shaky breath, her eyes widening as she immediately played the victim. She looked around at the nearby guests, trying to draw their attention to our confrontation. "Look at how aggressive she is getting." Trey, Chloe whimpered, her voice intentionally loud enough for an older couple standing near the dessert table to hear. "I was just trying to have a polite conversation with her, and she immediately attacks us. This is exactly what your mother was talking about. You just cannot reason with these people." The older couple threw a disapproving glance in my direction, clearly buying into Chloe's pathetic performance. It was the classic setup: the delicate blonde woman playing the innocent victim while painting the successful black woman as the angry, unhinged aggressor. It was a script she knew by heart, and she played her role flawlessly. But I was not about to fall into her trap and give her the explosive reaction she desperately wanted. I refused to be the angry black woman for her entertainment. Instead, I offered her a serene, patronizing smile. "Save the community theater performance, Chloe," I said smoothly, brushing an imaginary piece of lint off my expensive silk dress. "The fake tears might work on your husband when you need him to pay off your secret credit card debts, but they do absolutely nothing for me. You wanted to trap me in a corner and put me in my place, but you brought a butter knife to a gunfight." I had the absolute power to tell her right then and there that I was the silent majority owner of her precious boutique chain. I could have completely destroyed her arrogant world with a single sentence. But I held my tongue. The satisfaction of a quiet clap back was nothing compared to the absolute devastation of a public execution. I sidestepped them entirely, moving gracefully past Trey's rigid shoulder. I could feel their furious eyes burning holes into my back as I walked away. My heart was pounding with adrenaline, but my mind was completely focused. The verbal spar had only confirmed what I already knew. They were incredibly arrogant but fundamentally weak. They relied entirely on intimidation and false superiority to maintain their fragile egos. They had absolutely no idea that the ground they were standing on was already crumbling beneath their feet. I left them standing by the marble pillar and continued my search through the crowded ballroom, desperate to find my mother before they could do any more damage. I finally spotted my mother standing near the massive floor-to-ceiling windows at the far end of the ballroom. She had retreated as far away from the center of attention as physically possible, trying to blend into the heavy velvet curtains. She was holding a glass of tap water, looking out at the dark, perfectly manicured gardens. Her shoulders were hunched and she looked so incredibly small. The vibrant, joyful energy she had walked in with was completely gone, stolen by people who did not have a fraction of her character. Seeing her look so defeated in my own home shattered my heart, but it also solidified my absolute resolve to ruin every single person who had made her feel that way. I started walking toward her, navigating through the wealthy guests who were currently busy discussing stock portfolios and luxury vacations. But before I could reach her, I saw a flash of blonde hair cutting through the crowd from the opposite direction. It was Chloe. She had not let my earlier warning deter her at all. In fact, her bruised ego had clearly driven her to seek out an easier target. She wanted to reassert her dominance, and she knew my mother was too polite to fight back. I quickened my pace, my heart hammering a frantic rhythm against my ribs. I noticed that Chloe was no longer holding her delicate glass of champagne. Instead, she was holding a massive crystal goblet, filled to the absolute brim with dark red Pinot Noir. Nobody drinks heavy red wine while walking through a crowded ballroom full of people wearing light-colored designer gowns unless they have a specific malicious intention. Chloe approached my mother with the predatory glide of a snake. I was still 10 feet away, trapped behind a group of boisterous politicians, when I saw Chloe intentionally speed up her steps. She did not even pretend to trip. She simply walked directly into my mother's personal space and violently jerked her wrist forward. The dark red wine splashed heavily onto the front of my mother's handmade floral dress. The rich burgundy liquid instantly soaked into the modest fabric, spreading like a massive ugly bruise across the delicate flowers my mother had so carefully sewn together. The wine dripped down the skirt and splattered onto her worn-out shoes, leaving dark red droplets on the pristine white marble floor. A collective audible gasp ripped through the immediate circle of guests. The jazz music seemed to fade into the background as everyone turned to witness the spectacle. "Oh my goodness, Miss Shirley!" Chloe practically screamed, her voice laced with heavy theatrical shock. Her hands flew up to cover her mouth, in a perfectly calculated gesture of fake horror. "I am so incredibly sorry. I just did not see you standing there hiding in the shadows. You really should be careful where you stand in a room full of important people moving around. It is so easy for someone like you to just get completely overlooked." My mother stood completely frozen. Her hands were shaking violently as she looked down at the ruined fabric. This was the dress she had spent 3 sleepless nights working on. She had carefully selected the pattern and proudly showed it to me on a video call just last week. Now it was ruined, stained by the arrogant cruelty of a woman who had never worked a hard day in her entire life. A single tear escaped my mother's eye and rolled down her wrinkled cheek. The humiliation had officially reached its absolute peak. Several wealthy socialites nearby began to whisper behind their hands, their eyes darting between Chloe and the poor older woman dripping in cheap wine. They were eating up the drama, waiting to see how the hired help would react to being put in her place. I broke through the crowd and stepped directly between Chloe and my mother. The entire room seemed to hold its collective breath. Chloe took a half step back, her fake sympathetic smile faltering just a tiny bit when she saw the look in my eyes. She was waiting for me to explode. She wanted me to scream and shout and throw a drink in her face so she could point her perfectly manicured finger and call me an angry, unhinged woman in front of Atlanta's elite. But I refused to give her the satisfaction of my anger. I did not cry. I did not raise my voice. I was completely, utterly cold. I turned my back to Chloe, completely dismissing her existence. I reached into my small designer clutch and pulled out a pure silk monogrammed handkerchief. I knelt down right there in the middle of the grand ballroom, my expensive silk gown pooling on the wine-stained marble floor. I gently took the hem of my mother's ruined dress and began to dab the dark stains with my silk handkerchief. "Oh, Nia, do not ruin your beautiful clothes for me," my mother whispered, her voice cracking with shame. "Just let me go to the bathroom and clean it. Let me just go home." "You are not going anywhere, Mom," I said softly, looking up at her with a reassuring smile. "You look beautiful. A little spilled wine cannot ruin the masterpiece you made." I slowly stood back up, holding the wine-stained silk handkerchief in my hand. I turned to face Chloe. She was standing there looking incredibly smug, clearly proud of her little destructive stunt. She thought she had won the psychological war. "Accidents happen," Nia, Chloe said, offering a sickeningly sweet pout. "I will gladly pay to have it dry cleaned. Just send the bill to my assistant. I am sure it will only cost a few dollars to fix that cheap material anyway." I took a slow, deliberate step toward her. The surrounding guests leaned in slightly, eager to hear my response. You do not need to worry about paying for the dry cleaning, Chloe, I said, my voice smooth and dangerously calm. It carried perfectly across the quieted circle of guests. Besides, I am not entirely sure your personal credit card could handle even a $5 dry cleaning bill right now. Chloe's smug smile froze. Her perfectly arched eyebrows twitched, and her pale skin seemed to lose a fraction of its color. "Excuse me," she stammered, trying to maintain her arrogant posture. I tilted my head, feigning a look of genuine sympathy. "I am just saying you really need to be more careful with your finances, Chloe. It is funny how clumsy you get when you drink. Almost as clumsy as you were last Tuesday at the Chanel boutique in Phipps Plaza." Chloe's eyes widened in sheer panic. The color completely drained from her face, leaving her looking like a terrified ghost. She opened her mouth to speak, but no sound came out. I took another step closer, ensuring the wealthy women standing nearby could hear every single devastating word. "You know it was incredibly embarrassing for everyone involved." I continued, my tone conversational but razor sharp. "You tried to buy that limited edition lambskin flap bag to impress your little country club friends, but your personal platinum card was loudly declined at the register. Not just once, but 3 separate times. The cashier actually had to ask you to step aside because you were holding up a line of women who could actually afford to shop there. You begged them to run it a 4th time, claiming it was a bank error, but we both know your accounts are completely maxed out." A loud collective murmur rippled through the crowd. In this specific circle of high society, having your credit card declined at a luxury boutique was the ultimate cardinal sin. It was a clear, undeniable sign that you were faking your wealth. The wealthy socialites who had been judging my mother just moments ago were now staring at Chloe with absolute, unfiltered disgust. "You are a liar," Chloe hissed, her voice trembling violently as she looked around at the judging faces. Her fake sweet persona had completely shattered. She was gripping her empty wine glass so tightly I thought it might shatter in her hand. "Stop making up these ridiculous ghetto lies about me." I smiled a cold, terrifying smile. "I do not need to lie, Chloe. I know exactly what your financial situation looks like down to the very last penny. You walk around this party pouring wine on hard-working women, pretending you belong in the upper echelon of society. But underneath those expensive blonde extensions, you are absolutely terrified because you know you are completely broke. You are nothing but a massive fraud living in a house of cards, and the wind is starting to blow." Chloe stumbled backward, her chest heaving as she struggled to breathe. She looked frantically around the room for her husband Trey, but he was nowhere to be found. The powerful elite women she had spent years desperately trying to impress were now actively stepping away from her, creating a wide circle of isolation around her trembling figure. The sheer humiliation radiating off her was palpable. I turned away from her pale, shaking form and gently placed my hand on my mother's arm. The audience of elite guests watched in stunned silence as the power dynamic in the room fundamentally shifted. They had just witnessed a masterclass in psychological destruction, and they knew the counterattack was only just beginning. I guided my mother gently away from the scene, leaving Chloe standing completely alone in the center of the room, drowning in the public exposure of her own pathetic lies. I led my mother toward a quiet alcove near the garden terrace, far away from the glaring eyes of the ballroom. I found a plush velvet chair and gently helped her sit down, making sure she was comfortable. The dark wine stain on her dress was still visible, but her breathing had finally started to slow down. I stood beside her, acting as a physical shield between her and the rest of the room. I was just about to ask a waiter to bring us some sparkling water when a sharp, piercing sound cut through the ambient noise of the party. It was the distinct sound of a silver spoon repeatedly clinking against fine crystal. The live jazz band immediately stopped playing mid-note. The low hum of networking and social chatter faded into complete silence as hundreds of heads turned simultaneously toward the center of the room. I looked over my shoulder and saw my mother-in-law, Vivian, standing at the very top of the grand marble staircase that led down into the ballroom. She had perfectly positioned herself so that the massive crystal chandelier hung directly above her, acting like a theatrical spotlight. She held her champagne glass high, a sickeningly regal smile plastered across her face. She looked exactly like a woman who believed she was the absolute reigning queen of Atlanta high society. This was her element. This was the exact type of grand performative moment she lived for. Ladies and gentlemen, Vivian began, her voice projecting loudly across the massive room, echoing off the high ceilings. If I could please have your attention for just a few moments. We have gathered here tonight to celebrate a very special milestone. I felt my jaw clench so tightly my teeth began to ache. We were not gathered here because of her. We were gathered here because I had spent a small fortune organizing catering and decorating this entire event. I had personally curated the guest list, ensuring that the most powerful venture capitalists and tech innovators in the city were present. I had paid for the expensive imported flowers, the premium open bar, and the live entertainment. But listening to Vivian speak, you would think she was the sole benefactor and gracious host of the entire evening. As I look out at all of your beautiful faces tonight, I am reminded of the incredible legacy of Black excellence that runs through the very veins of our family. She continued gracefully, descending the first few steps of the staircase. For generations, our family has stood as a pillar of strength, sophistication, and unyielding success in this great city. We are the descendants of highly educated pioneers. We are the proud products of elite private academies, prestigious historically Black colleges, and exclusive social organizations. We know what it means to uphold a standard of pure, absolute excellence. I watched her perform this ridiculous monologue with a mixture of absolute disgust and sheer fascination. She was putting on an absolute masterclass in bougie culture, dropping every single buzzword she could think of to remind the wealthy guests that she supposedly belonged to the old money elite. She talked about their history of summering in exclusive enclaves and attending high society cotillions. She painted a vivid picture of a family dripping in generational wealth and unmatched social pedigree. But I knew the ugly truth. I knew that beneath that emerald green sequined gown and all that arrogant posturing was a woman who was absolutely drowning in a sea of unpaid bills. I knew she had secretly taken out a third mortgage on her home before it was finally foreclosed on by the bank. I knew she had literally begged Marcus for money just to keep her luxury car from being repossessed last month. I had seen the desperate text messages and the past due collection notices, but standing on those marble stairs, she played the role of the wealthy matriarch so convincingly that even I would have believed her if I did not have her actual bank statements locked safely in my wall safe. And tonight, Vivian proclaimed, pausing dramatically halfway down the staircase, "We are here to celebrate the shining crown jewel of our family legacy, my wonderful, brilliant son Marcus." The crowd erupted into polite applause. Marcus stepped out from his group of banking friends, walking toward the bottom of the staircase with a smug, arrogant grin on his face. He buttoned his custom velvet jacket and looked up at his mother, soaking in the public validation he so desperately craved. He played the part of the humble, successful businessman, bowing his head slightly as the guests clapped for him. Vivian beamed at him, her eyes shining with fake tears of pride. "Marcus, you have always been destined for absolute greatness," she said, her voice thick with exaggerated emotion. "From the time you were a little boy, I knew you were going to move mountains. And look at what you have built. Look at this magnificent home. Look at the incredible life you have created through your tireless work ethic and your brilliant financial mind. You are the absolute definition of a self-made titan." My blood ran completely cold. I stood in the alcove staring at them in absolute disbelief. Look at what he had built. He did not build a single square inch of this mansion. My software company paid the massive down payment. I worked 80-hour weeks writing code and pitching to investors while he was out playing golf with his fraternity brothers. My successful tech patents paid the massive monthly mortgage. I picked out the imported Italian marble for the floors. I negotiated the landscaping contracts. Marcus had barely contributed enough to cover the monthly utility bills, but Vivian was standing in front of the most powerful people in the city, giving him the entire credit for my exhaustive labor. She did not mention my name once. She did not acknowledge me as his wife, his partner, or the actual owner of the massive estate they were currently standing in. I was completely erased from the narrative of my own life. To her, I was nothing more than an invisible wallet secretly financing their elaborate delusions of grandeur. The sheer audacity was so massive it was almost paralyzing. I looked around the room at the investors and politicians who actually knew the truth. The people who had actually done business with me knew that I was the powerhouse behind the wealth. I could see my lead venture capitalist exchanging a confused, uncomfortable glance with one of my board members. They knew Marcus was just a mid-level banker riding on the coattails of my massive success. But Vivian was too wrapped up in her own narcissistic fantasy to notice the shifting dynamics in the crowd. She reached the bottom of the stairs, and Marcus took her hand, kissing her cheek for the audience. She turned back to face the crowd, raising her glass even higher. "Our family has always believed in supporting our own," Vivian declared, her voice ringing with absolute authority. "We believe in taking the wealth that our ancestors worked so hard to accumulate and passing it down to the next generation of leaders. Marcus has proven himself to be a brilliant financial mind at the bank, but it is time for him to spread his wings and build his own empire." I saw Trey standing near the bar, nodding enthusiastically, his earlier embarrassment completely forgotten as he rode his mother's wave of arrogance. Even Chloe had managed to crawl out of her corner of shame, plastering that fake smile back on her face as she watched the spectacle unfold. They were all rallying behind the matriarch, desperate to cling to the illusion of power she was projecting to the room. My mother squeezed my hand, her eyes wide with worry. She could hear the complete erasure of my existence in Vivienne's speech, and I knew it was breaking her heart all over again. But I just smiled down at her, squeezing her hand back reassuringly. I was not upset, I was actually thrilled. Vivian was digging her own grave deeper with every single arrogant word that fell from her lips. She was setting the stage perfectly for the ultimate public execution. "I want everyone to raise their glasses," Vivian commanded, looking out over the sea of wealthy guests. "Tonight is not just an anniversary. Tonight marks the beginning of a massive new chapter for our family legacy. I have a very special financial announcement to make regarding the future of our family wealth, and I want all of you to be the first to hear it." I let go of my mother's hand and took a slow, deliberate step out of the alcove. The time for standing in the shadows was officially over. It was time to let her drop the final piece of the trap before I burned their entire fake empire to the ground. I moved silently through the crowd, my expensive silk dress brushing against the tailored suits of the investors I had personally invited. I stopped a few feet away from the grand staircase, perfectly blending into the sea of guests. I crossed my arms and watched Vivian command the room. She was practically glowing with narcissistic delight, feeding off the undivided attention of Atlanta's most powerful people. As many of you know, our family has meticulously managed a private generational trust fund for over 8 decades. Vivian projected her voice echoing off the high ceilings. "We have always been extremely discreet about our wealth, preferring to move quietly in the background. But today, in honor of Marcus and his incredible achievements, we have decided to unlock a significant portion of that historical endowment." She paused dramatically, letting the suspense build in the room. I could see my lead venture capitalist raising an eyebrow, clearly confused by this sudden revelation of hidden family wealth. He knew Marcus was just a mid-level employee at a standard commercial bank. "I am absolutely thrilled to officially announce that the family trust is providing an initial capital injection of $5 million. Vivian declared, her chest puffed out with arrogant pride. "This money will be used to launch Marcus into his own independent investment firm, making him a major player in the global financial market." A wave of impressed murmurs washed over the crowd. People began to clap politely, raising their champagne glasses toward Marcus. Marcus stood at the bottom of the stairs, bowing his head in fake humility. He looked so incredibly triumphant. He was fully leaning into the delusion, completely ignoring the fact that his mother did not even have $500 in her checking account. She was drowning in credit card debt and constantly dodging calls from aggressive collection agencies, but here she was publicly promising $5 million out of thin air. The sheer magnitude of the lie was breathtaking. And that is not all, Vivian continued, holding up her hand to quiet the applause. To serve as the official corporate headquarters for this new financial empire, we are utilizing our most prized ancestral asset. At her exact cue, Trey stepped forward from the bar area. He was carrying a massive, beautifully framed photograph, and he proudly placed it on a wooden easel positioned right next to the grand staircase. The crowd shifted slightly to get a better look. It was a stunning picture of a sprawling historic colonial mansion. The house featured massive white pillars wrap-around porches, and it was surrounded by ancient weeping willow trees and lush, perfectly manicured gardens. It looked like a property straight out of a billionaire luxury magazine. The Savannah Estate. Vivian sighed dramatically, placing her hand over her heart, as if she were deeply moved by her own words. This magnificent property has been the crown jewel of our family for generations. It is a symbol of our enduring power, our rich history, and our impeccable taste. We have recently completed a multi-million-dollar renovation to restore it to its original breathtaking glory. Starting next month, we will be hosting exclusive corporate retreats there for Marcus and his top-tier wealthy clients. The guests let out an audible gasp of admiration. Several prominent local politicians nodded in deep respect. But Vivian was not finished. She had one more calculated move to make. She wanted to use this moment of absolute perceived power to completely crush the one person she viewed as a threat to her social dominance. Vivian paused, her gaze slowly sweeping over the crowded ballroom until her eyes locked directly onto the quiet alcove near the garden terrace. She stared straight at my mother. Vivian's fake smile sharpened into a cruel, mocking sneer. "You see, building true, lasting wealth requires a certain elite pedigree," Vivian said, her voice dripping with heavy condescension. "It requires proper breeding and an innate understanding of how high society functions. It is not something you can just stumble into by pure luck. And it is certainly not something you can achieve by scrubbing hospital floors or doing dirty manual labor for minimum wage." The air in the room suddenly grew very thin. The blatant insult was impossible to ignore. It takes generations of excellence to secure a legacy like the Savannah Estate. Vivian continued, her voice rising with malicious authority. "Some people are simply meant to build massive empires and lead the community, while others are unfortunately just destined to clean up after them. We must all learn to accept our proper places in the social order. Is not that right, Miss Shirley?" The silence that followed was heavy and suffocating. A few of my tech investors looked incredibly uncomfortable, shifting their weight and looking away. But then, the unthinkable happened. Chloe let out a loud, obnoxious laugh from her spot near the marble pillar. Trey immediately joined in, clapping his hands together in aggressive agreement. Seeing their confident reaction, a few of the older elite guests, the ones who had completely bought into Vivian's aristocratic performance, actually nodded in agreement. Slowly, a smattering of applause broke out. Within seconds, the entire ballroom was clapping, applauding the announcement, and completely ignoring the blatant, targeted humiliation of a sweet, elderly woman. I watched Marcus, the man who had vowed to protect me, smile and clap along with the rest of his toxic family. He was actively celebrating the public degradation of my mother. I stood completely frozen in the middle of the crowd, listening to the thunderous applause echoing around me. Anyone else might have broken down in tears right then and there. Anyone else might have started screaming, throwing crystal glasses, and demanding that everyone get out of their house immediately. But I did not feel the urge to scream. The blinding red-hot rage that had been boiling inside my chest suddenly crystallized into pure, absolute ice. As I stared at the framed photograph of the Savannah mansion sitting on the easel, a strange tingling sensation spread through my entire body. I looked at Vivian, basking in the unearned applause. I looked at Marcus, puffing out his chest with fake pride, And then I looked back at the picture of the house, the historic Savannah estate, the absolute crown jewel of their fake generational wealth. They were currently standing in front of 200 of the wealthiest people in Atlanta, bragging about a massive family trust fund that simply did not exist. But the most hilarious part of Vivian's entire speech, the part that proved she was completely detached from reality, was her grand claim about the Savannah mansion. She was publicly boasting about a house that the bank had brutally foreclosed on nearly 8 months ago, due to her massive unpaid debts and third mortgages. And the absolute best part, the part that made my blood run completely cold with glorious anticipation, was the fact that my private real estate holding company was the anonymous buyer who had purchased the property directly from the bank. I owned the Savannah estate. Every single brick, every single weeping willow tree, and every blade of grass belonged entirely to me. As the applause continued to wash over the ballroom, I slowly crossed my arms over my chest, and a slow, dark smirk spread across my face. It was time to introduce them to the real owner. Before I took another step toward that grand staircase to rip away their pathetic illusion, I turned back to the quiet velvet alcove. I wanted my mother standing right beside me when I delivered the final crushing blow. I wanted her to see the exact moment the arrogant smirks were completely wiped off their faces. But when I looked over my shoulder, the plush velvet seat was completely empty. The half-empty glass of tap water sat abandoned on the small side table. A sudden spike of panic pierced through my chest, completely overriding the cold, calculating anger I had just felt. I whipped my head around, scanning the dense crowd of cheering guests. The ballroom was still erupting in applause for Marcus and his fake new empire. People were raising their crystal flutes and patting him on the back, completely oblivious to the brutal psychological warfare that had just taken place. I pushed my way through a group of wealthy socialites, ignoring their confused expressions as I frantically searched for the familiar handmade floral dress. Then I saw it. Out of the corner of my eye, I caught a brief flash of floral fabric slipping behind the heavy stainless steel swinging doors, located at the far end of the room. It was the entrance to the massive catering kitchen. My heart sank heavily into my stomach. Vivian had literally told her to go sit in the corner of the kitchen, and my sweet, exhausted mother had actually listened. I marched past the dessert tables and shoved the heavy metal doors open, stepping out of the glamorous illusion and into the stark, harsh reality of the service area. The contrast between the two spaces was absolutely jarring. On one side of the doors there was warm golden lighting, the soft, elegant sounds of live jazz music, and the intoxicating scent of expensive imported perfumes. On the other side there was blinding fluorescent lighting, the overwhelming smell of roasted meats and industrial bleach, and the chaotic, deafening clatter of 50 catering staff members rushing to plate the next course. I navigated through the maze of stainless steel prep tables, dodging waiters carrying massive silver trays. I finally found her tucked away in the deepest, most humiliating corner of the room. She was standing right next to the giant industrial trash bins near the back service elevator. The symbolism of her location made me physically sick. This was exactly where Vivian and Chloe wanted her. Hidden away in the garbage, completely erased from the beautiful world she had sacrificed her entire life to help me enter. My mother was holding her old, cracked smartphone, her trembling fingers clumsily tapping on the bright screen. The massive red wine stain from Chloe's little stunt had dried into a stiff, dark crust across the front of her dress. She looked incredibly fragile, her shoulders completely slumped forward in absolute defeat. Silent tears were streaming down her wrinkled cheeks, dropping onto the glowing screen of her phone. "Mom!" I called out, my voice cracking despite my best efforts to stay strong. She jumped, slightly startled by my voice. She quickly reached up to wipe her wet cheeks with the back of her hand, trying to force a brave smile that completely failed to reach her eyes. "Naya. Baby, you should not be back here," she whispered, her voice thick with unshed tears. "Your dress is going to get dirty. Go back out to your guests. I am just calling a car to take me home." "You are not leaving," I said, stepping closer to her and ignoring the bustling catering staff moving around us. The party is not even halfway over. My mother shook her head vigorously, staring down at her worn-out shoes. I have to go, Nia. Vivian was right. I do not belong here. I stick out like a sore thumb, and I am just making everyone uncomfortable. I am embarrassing your husband, and I am embarrassing you. I just wanted to come and see my beautiful daughter shine in her new life, but I am just casting a dark shadow over your special night. Hearing the woman who gave me everything speak about herself with such profound shame absolutely shattered me. I closed the distance between us and gently took the cracked smartphone out of her trembling hands. The screen showed an active ride-sharing request. She had selected the cheapest shared car option to take her back to her modest apartment. Without hesitating, I pressed the cancel button and slipped the phone into my designer clutch. You are not casting a shadow over anything, I said, my voice trembling with a mixture of deep sorrow and ferocious anger. You are the only reason I have any light at all. Do you honestly think I care about what those arrogant vultures outside have to say about you? She looked up at me, her eyes wide and vulnerable. But your husband, she started, her voice trailing off as another tear slipped down her cheek. Marcus was so ashamed of me, Nia. I saw the way he turned his back. I saw the way his friends looked at me. I do not want to be the reason your marriage falls apart. I can just slip out the back service elevator and nobody will even notice I am gone. I reached out and gently held both of her arms, forcing her to look me directly in the eyes. I needed her to understand the absolute truth before I burned the entire house down. My marriage is already over, Mom, I said firmly, letting the reality of those words sink in for both of us. Marcus is a coward. He is a weak, pathetic man who values the opinions of broke socialites over the woman who actually pays for the roof over his head. My mother gasped softly, her hands flying up to cover her mouth. Nia, please do not say things you cannot take back. You have built such a beautiful life here. This life is beautiful because I built it. I corrected her, my voice gaining strength and volume. I built it with the work ethic you taught me. You scrubbed hospital floors on your hands and knees so I could sit in boardrooms. You wore the same winter coat for 10 years so I could have a brand new laptop for college. You built a real empire with a mop and a bucket while the people out in that ballroom are currently suffocating under mountains of credit card debt just to pretend they are rich. I pointed back toward the heavy swinging doors that separated us from the party. The people standing out there drinking my champagne are completely broke, Mom. Vivian is drowning in debt. Trey and Chloe are a financial disaster. They are standing on a stage that I bought, and they have the absolute audacity to look down on you. They told you to come to the kitchen because they are terrified of your authenticity. They want to hide you away because standing next to a real, hard-working woman exposes exactly how fake they truly are. My mother stared at me, her tears slowly stopping as she processed the heavy weight of my words. She had spent her entire evening shrinking herself, trying to make herself as small as possible to fit into their narrow, arrogant worldview. Now she was finally seeing the massive cracks in their perfect aristocratic facade. I will never let you leave my house through a back service elevator like an unwanted piece of trash, I said, my voice dropping to a low, fierce whisper. You are going to walk back out there with your head held high. You are going to stand right next to me while I take a wrecking ball to their entire pathetic reality. But first, I need to make a quick stop at my office. I have a few very important documents that Mother Vivian is going to want to see. I wrapped my arms securely around her waist. She hesitated for one brief second, looking down at the massive wine stain on her dress. I pulled her closer, letting her know that the stain did not matter. It was a badge of honor in a room full of cowards. I guided her away from the trash bins, away from the service elevator, and marched her right back toward the swinging metal doors. The time for crying in the kitchen was over. The time for absolute destruction had arrived. We only took 3 steps toward those heavy metal doors before my mother stopped dead in her tracks. She planted her worn-out shoes firmly on the kitchen tile and gently pulled her arm out of my grasp. I turned around to look at her, expecting to see more tears, but instead, I saw a deep, desperate terror in her eyes. She was breathing heavily, shaking her head as she looked frantically back toward the dark corner by the trash bins. It was as if she was physically allergic to the idea of standing up for herself. She reached out and grabbed both of my hands, gripping them with a surprising, desperate strength. "Nia, please listen to me," she begged, her voice completely raw and cracking under the heavy emotional weight. "You cannot do this. You cannot throw away your entire marriage and your beautiful life over one bad night. Do you remember the hospital? Do you remember those brutal double shifts I used to work? I scrubbed those hospital floors on my hands and knees every single night. I worked with those harsh industrial chemicals until my skin cracked open and my hands literally bled. I would come home when the sun was coming up and my lungs would burn from the bleach. I did all of that just so I could afford to put you in those expensive advanced coding classes. I destroyed my own body so you would never have to work a minimum wage job. I sacrificed everything so you could escape our neighborhood and build a real life." She paused, trying to catch her breath as the loud catering staff continued to rush past us, completely ignoring our intense private moment. I looked down at her hands holding mine. I could clearly see the permanent thick scars on her knuckles and the deep calluses that would never fully fade. "I did not bleed so you could end up divorced and fighting with your wealthy in-laws," she continued, her voice dropping to a desperate whisper. "I wanted you to have the perfect family, Nia. I wanted you to have a husband with a respectable job and a beautiful house in a safe neighborhood. I wanted you to have a family that wore nice clothes and went to fancy country clubs. You have the perfect family now. They are important elite people, Nia. Sometimes you just have to swallow your pride and endure things to keep the peace. You have to endure it for the sake of the family. Look at what you have built here. Do not let my foolish pride tear down your perfect family. Please just let me leave and you go back out there and smile for your guests." A single hot tear escaped my eye and rolled slowly down my cheek. I stood there in the harsh, blinding fluorescent light of that catering kitchen, letting her desperate words wash over me. She had spent her entire adult life swallowing her pride and enduring unimaginable pain just to give me a chance at success. She viewed my marriage to Marcus as her ultimate victory. To her, Marcus and his arrogant relatives represented the pinnacle of high society perfection. She honestly believed that enduring their toxic abuse was just the necessary price of admission into this wealthy world. She was willing to let them treat her like absolute garbage just to protect my fragile illusion of a perfect life. As that single tear fell from my chin and splashed onto the cold tile floor, a massive fundamental shift occurred deep inside my soul. The heavy, crushing sadness that had been suffocating me all night instantly evaporated into thin air. Every ounce of grief I felt over my failed marriage completely vanished. In its place, a cold, dark, and absolute rage began to burn. It was a pure, concentrated fury, unlike anything I had ever experienced in my entire life. My vision tunneled and my heartbeat slowed to a calm, deadly rhythm. I looked at the woman who had given me the world and realized I had been letting monsters live in her castle. I squeezed her scarred hands tightly, forcing her to look up and meet my eyes. I needed her to hear the absolute, unwavering conviction in my voice. "They are not family, Mom." I said my words, cutting through the chaotic noise of the kitchen like a razor blade. "They are parasites." My mother blinked in shock, her mouth opening slightly, but I did not let her interrupt. I stepped closer to her, lowering my voice into a fierce, steady octave. "A real family protects you," I explained firmly. "A real family uplifts you and celebrates your existence. What Marcus and Vivian and Chloe are doing is not family. They are leeches who have attached themselves to my success. They are feeding off my hard work while simultaneously trying to destroy the very roots that made me strong. You think they are the perfect family just because they wear designer clothes and speak with an arrogant tone. But under all that fake glamour, they are nothing but broke, desperate cowards." I let go of one of her hands and pointed toward the swinging metal doors that led back to the party. "The perfect family you always dreamed of me having is a complete mirage, Mom. It is a shiny, beautiful apple that is completely rotten on the inside. Enduring their abuse is not keeping the peace. It is just feeding the parasites. They do not respect me, and they certainly do not respect you. They are draining my bank accounts, living in houses I secretly purchased, and using my hard-earned money to buy the imported champagne they are currently using to toast their own fake superiority. Marcus is not a respectable husband. He is a pathetic, weak man who uses my bank account to fund his mother's narcissistic delusions. My mother stared at me, her eyes wide, as the true reality of my situation finally started to sink in. I could see the decades of social conditioning and self-doubt actively fighting against the undeniable truth in my words. I would rather lose every single dime I ever made and go back to living in our tiny one-bedroom apartment than spend another second pretending these leeches are my equals, I told her, my voice filled with a terrifying calm. I did not spend years building a multi-million-dollar tech company just to let a bunch of broke socialites disrespect the woman who scrubbed floors to get me there. Enduring their cruelty does not make us noble, Mom. It just makes us their victims. And I absolutely refuse to be a victim in my own house. I reached up and gently wiped a stray tear from her wrinkled cheek. By the end of this night, they will never be able to look down on anyone ever again, I promised her, looking deep into her eyes. I am going to surgically remove them from my life, and I am going to make sure they feel the absolute agonizing pain of that separation. They wanted to show everyone who the real elite are tonight. I am going to give them exactly what they asked for. My mother looked at the cold, unyielding determination burning in my eyes. She looked down at her own scarred hands, and then back up at me. The deep terror that had been paralyzing her slowly began to fade away, replaced by a quiet, rising strength. She had fought her whole life to make me strong, and she was finally seeing the full, terrifying extent of that strength. She nodded slowly, standing a little taller despite the ruined, wine-stained dress she was wearing. She tightened her grip on my hands, signaling that she was finally ready to stop running. I turned back toward the heavy metal doors, my mind completely focused on the execution of my plan. The awakening was complete. The quiet, obedient wife they thought they could manipulate was officially dead. We pushed through the swinging stainless steel doors together, leaving the kitchen behind us forever. We bypassed the crowded ballroom and headed straight down the long, silent hallway toward my private office. I needed to open my secure wall safe and gather the heavy financial ammunition I needed to end their fake aristocratic reign once and for all. We walked side by side down the long carpeted hallway, leaving the deafening noise of the catering kitchen far behind us. The heavy bass of the jazz band and the obnoxious laughter of the party guests grew fainter with every step we took. My mother leaned on my arm, her breathing finally slowing down to a normal, steady rhythm. The walk to my private study felt completely different this time. When I dragged Marcus down this exact same hallway earlier tonight, I was a desperate, heartbroken wife begging for a scrap of loyalty. Now, walking with the woman who actually deserved my loyalty, I was a commanding general preparing for absolute corporate warfare. I did not feel an ounce of sadness. I only felt a terrifying, crystal-clear focus. We reached the end of the corridor, and I pushed open the heavy mahogany double doors. I guided my mother inside and firmly shut the doors behind us, turning the brass deadbolt with a loud, definitive click. The chaotic energy of the anniversary party was instantly sealed outside. The study was bathed in the soft, warm glow of a single brass desk lamp. My mother stood near the entrance, looking around the room with a sense of quiet awe. She had only been in this specific room a handful of times because Marcus always complained when her shoes touched his precious imported Persian rug. But this was not his room. It was mine. The walls were lined with custom-built oak bookshelves displaying the dozens of industry awards I had won over the years. Framed patents for my financial software algorithms hung proudly above the leather sofa. This room was a monument to the blood, sweat, and tears that both my mother and I had poured into my future. I watched her gently run her scarred fingers over the polished mahogany edge of my desk. For the first time all night, she actually looked safe. She looked protected. "Sit down, Mom," I told her softly, pointing to the plush leather armchair in the corner. You are going to want to be comfortable when I show you exactly how broke your perfect elite family actually is. She slowly lowered herself into the chair, her eyes tracking my every movement. I walked past my massive desk and approached the floor-to-ceiling bookshelf covering the far wall. I reached up and carefully removed a heavy leather-bound copy of a business biography. Behind the book, perfectly flush with the dark wood paneling, was a small, sleek biometric scanner. I pressed my right thumb against the glowing blue glass. The machine beeped softly, and a hidden motor whirred to life. A 2-foot section of the wooden bookshelf smoothly slid open, revealing a heavy steel wall safe seamlessly built into the foundation of the house. Marcus had absolutely no idea this safe even existed. He thought I kept all our important documents in his flimsy metal filing cabinet downstairs. He was incredibly arrogant, but he was never particularly observant. I quickly punched in the 6-digit passcode and pulled the heavy steel door open. Inside, resting on a velvet shelf, was a sleek black iPad Pro. It was not my primary work tablet. This specific device was entirely dedicated to one single highly confidential project. I had aptly named it Project Demolition. I pulled the cold metal tablet from the safe and walked back over to my desk, leaning against the edge so my mother could see the screen. I tapped the glass to wake it up, and the device instantly demanded a secondary facial recognition scan. As the screen unlocked, the camera angle of my life completely shifted. If someone were standing right behind me looking directly over my shoulder, they would see the absolute terrifying extent of my preparation. They would see that I had not just been a blind, trusting wife for the past 5 years. I had been quietly keeping score. For half a year, I had played the role of the oblivious, busy tech founder. I smiled at family dinners, I paid for expensive vacations, and I let Marcus believe he was a master manipulator. But every single night after he fell asleep confident in his own lies, I would come down to this exact office. I would lock the doors, brew a pot of black coffee, and run my proprietary financial tracking software to trace every single stolen dollar. It took months of meticulous digital forensic work to pierce through the endless layers of shell companies, offshore accounts, and fake legal entities Marcus had desperately tried to hide his theft behind. I opened the primary master file, and a massive, highly detailed cash flow chart immediately filled the bright screen. The graph was incredibly complex, but visually undeniable. Thick green lines representing my tech company revenue flowed generously into our joint checking accounts. But right below that were dozens of jagged red lines bleeding out like a massive arterial wound. I zoomed in on the screen, showing my mother the specific transaction histories. Those red lines represented every single time Marcus had secretly siphoned money out of our shared assets. Look at this, I said, pointing to a massive dip in the graph dated exactly 4 months ago. This is a wire transfer for $50,000. Marcus told me it was a high-risk corporate investment for his bank. But if you follow the routing numbers, it goes directly to a shell corporation owned entirely by Trey. He used my money to bail out his brother's failing tech startup right before their investors threatened to sue them for gross mismanagement. My mother gasped, covering her mouth as she read the digital bank statements. I swiped left across the screen, bringing up a completely different folder. This one was labeled Savannah Estate Holdings. I tapped a high-resolution PDF document, expanding it to fill the screen. It was a massive stack of official real estate purchase contracts and highly confidential bank foreclosure records. This is the house Vivian was just bragging about to the entire ballroom, I explained, my voice dripping with cold satisfaction. The grand historic mansion, she claims, is the crown jewel of their generational wealth. The bank foreclosed on her 8 months ago because she had secretly taken out 3 separate mortgages just to fund her extreme shopping habits and country club dues. She was completely bankrupt and facing total public humiliation. But she begged the bank for an extension, claiming she had a wealthy anonymous buyer willing to pay in all cash to settle the debt. I tapped the final page of the contract, highlighting the signature line. The anonymous buyer was a private limited liability company called Shirley Investments. I named the LLC after you, Mom. I bought the house out from under her using the money I made from my software patents. Vivian does not own a single brick of that property. I own it. I let her stay there as a pathetic act of charity because Marcus begged me to keep her out of a homeless shelter. But tonight that charity is officially terminated. I swiped the screen one final time, opening a folder titled Boutique Acquisitions. This was the absolute final nail in the coffin. A pristine digital copy of a majority shareholder agreement appeared on the glass screen. It detailed the massive corporate buyout of a struggling retail chain. "This is Chloe's business," I told my mother, pointing to the corporate letterhead. "She runs around this party pouring wine on your handmade dress, acting like she is a self-made female entrepreneur. The reality is, her business was hemorrhaging money and facing total liquidation last year. I swooped in through another proxy firm and bought 60% of her failing company just to keep her out of bankruptcy court. I am her boss. I am the silent majority shareholder. And according to this specific clause in the contract, I have the absolute unchecked authority to fire the managing director, which is Chloe, at any time for any reason with zero severance pay." My mother sat completely frozen in the leather armchair, staring at the glowing screen of the iPad. The sheer magnitude of my financial control over these arrogant people was almost too massive to fully comprehend. They had spent the entire night parading around my mansion acting like untouchable royalty. They had publicly humiliated the most important person in my life, believing they held all the power. They had absolutely no idea that I held the deeds, the contracts, and the ultimate kill switches to every single aspect of their fake, luxurious lives. I locked the iPad screen and slipped the slim device into the deep hidden pocket of my silk dress. The master plan was fully loaded, and the safety was officially off. I looked at my mother and offered her my hand. She looked at the scars on her knuckles, took a deep, steadying breath, and placed her hand firmly in mine. It was time to go back to the party. It was time to take the microphone. As my mother held my hand, I took one final look around my quiet study. The warm brass lighting cast long shadows across the mahogany bookshelves and the framed patents on the wall. For the past 6 months, this room had been my absolute secret war room. Every single night, I had sat at that massive oak desk meticulously piecing together the complicated financial puzzle of my husband's fraudulent life. I had carried the crushing weight of these 3 massive secrets completely alone, swallowing my anger, and playing the role of the perfectly supportive wife. But now speaking them out loud and showing the undeniable proof to my mother had unlocked something incredibly dark and powerful inside of me. My inner monologue was racing rapidly through the precise sequence of events I was about to trigger. I needed to execute this demolition flawlessly. I thought about Marcus and that stolen $500,000, $500,000. That was not just a casual accounting error or a temporary lapse in financial judgment. That was a calculated, malicious theft executed by the very man who shared my bed. I remembered the exact night I first discovered the glaring discrepancy in our joint investment accounts. I had been reviewing our quarterly corporate tax documents when I noticed a massive wire transfer routed through a suspicious dummy corporation. When I spent 3 days tracing the hidden routing numbers and discovered it went straight into Trey's failing tech startup, I actually threw up in the bathroom sink. My own husband had stolen from the empire I built from scratch just to prop up his lazy, arrogant brother. And the absolute worst part was that Marcus genuinely believed he was completely entitled to it. He believed that because we were legally married, my hard-earned capital was his personal limitless slush fund to maintain his family's fake aristocratic image. But Marcus was not nearly as smart as he thought he was. He had completely forgotten about the ironclad prenuptial agreement my corporate lawyers had aggressively forced him to sign 5 years ago. That strict legal contract contained a very specific fraud and embezzlement clause. By secretly transferring that money without my written consent, he had not only committed a massive felony, but he had also legally voided any right to my assets in a divorce. He had effectively handed me the loaded gun I was about to use to blow his entire life apart. The pain of his betrayal had been completely replaced by the cold, hard thrill of absolute leverage. Then my thoughts quickly shifted to Vivian. Mother Vivian, with her heavy emerald green sequined gown, and her endless condescending speeches about black excellence and elite bloodlines. She was currently standing in my grand ballroom accepting thunderous applause for a generational trust fund that was completely imaginary. The absolute audacity of her claiming the Savannah Mansion as a symbol of her enduring power made my blood boil and my heart sing at the exact same time. She was living inside a massive, pathetic delusion. The Savannah estate was supposed to be her ultimate trump card over me. It was the historic property she constantly threw in my face to remind me that I was just new money from a working-class neighborhood. She used that massive house with its white pillars and weeping willows to establish her dominance in high society. But the actual reality was that she had driven that historic legacy straight into the ground. She had selfishly leveraged that house 3 separate times, taking out multiple toxic mortgages just to pay for her luxury cars, her designer clothes, and her exclusive country club memberships. When the bank finally slammed the door shut and initiated the brutal foreclosure process, she was utterly terrified of the public scandal. She knew her elite friends would immediately excommunicate her, so I swooped in completely anonymously through Shirley Investments. I paid the bank in pure, unadulterated cash. I own the title. I own the land. I own the very floorboards she proudly walks on. For the past 8 months, she had been living rent-free in a house that belonged entirely to the exact same hard-working woman she had just told to go sit in the kitchen. The poetic justice of that hidden reality was so incredibly sweet, I could almost taste it on my tongue. I was going to let her finish soaking in the admiration of the entire city, and then I was going to publicly hand her a brutal eviction notice in front of her most important peers. And finally, there was Chloe, the fragile blonde gatekeeper of the black elite who desperately wanted to be part of the wealthy inner circle. Chloe absolutely loved to play the role of the highly successful independent female entrepreneur. She loved to use her boutique chain as a weapon to belittle people she deemed financially inferior. Earlier tonight, she had purposefully poured dark red wine on my mother's handmade dress and bragged about her wealthy, luxurious lifestyle. But my internal digital ledger held the ultimate devastating truth. Her entire retail business was a massive, catastrophic financial disaster. She was terrible at managing supply chains, she actively alienated her best hardworking employees, and her profit margins had been deeply negative for 24 straight months. When her primary investors pulled their funding last year, she was facing total corporate liquidation and complete personal bankruptcy. I used a proxy venture capital firm to quietly buy up 60% of her outstanding shares. I injected just enough capital to keep the doors open and the lights on. But I made sure the new strict operating agreement gave the majority shareholder absolute unchecked executive control. I literally owned 60% of her entire identity. I had the legal authority to walk into her flagship store tomorrow morning, fire her on the very spot, seize all the expensive inventory, and liquidate the company assets to recoup my massive investment. She thought she was asserting her social dominance by ruining a $50 dress. She had absolutely no idea that I held the unchecked power to completely ruin her career, her reputation, and her bank account with a single phone call. These 3 massive secrets were heavy corporate artillery, and they were securely locked and loaded in the digital arsenal currently resting in my pocket. I looked at my mother. The physical transformation in her posture was truly beautiful to witness. Just 20 minutes ago, she was crying by the industrial trash bins in the catering kitchen, frantically shrinking herself to fit into their cruel, toxic narrative. Now she was standing tall in my mahogany study, breathing evenly. The dark wine stain was still highly visible on her dress, but it no longer looked like a sad mark of shame. It looked like hard-earned battle armor. She squeezed my hand, giving me a firm, determined nod. We did not need to exchange any more words. We both knew exactly what had to be done. I unlocked the heavy study doors and we stepped back out into the long carpeted corridor. The walk back to the grand ballroom felt like a slow-motion sequence in a tense, dramatic movie. Every single step my high heels took against the hardwood floor felt like a loud ticking clock counting down the final remaining seconds of Marcus and his family's fake, luxurious lives. As we moved closer to the main party area, the sounds of the celebration grew significantly louder. I could hear the upbeat tempo of the live jazz band starting up again, filling the massive house with elegant music. I could hear the clinking of expensive crystal glasses and the loud, boisterous laughter of the elite wealthy guests. They were still celebrating. They were still raising their champagne flutes to Marcus and his imaginary $5 million investment firm. I kept my head held high, my spine perfectly straight, and my facial expression completely unreadable. I was not the emotional, heartbroken wife anymore. I was the silent majority shareholder of their entire miserable existence. I was the legitimate landlord of their fake ancestral home. I was the financial executioner they had foolishly invited to their own public hanging. We reached the end of the long hallway and paused just outside the massive open archway that led directly into the glowing ballroom. The bright, dazzling lights of the crystal chandeliers washed over us. I could see Vivian still holding court near the bottom of the grand staircase, completely surrounded by a tight circle of admiring local politicians. I could see Trey and Chloe laughing loudly near the lavish dessert table, clinking their glasses together in pure triumph. And I could see Marcus, my treacherous, cowardly husband, soaking up the unwarranted praise of his senior banking partners with a smug, arrogant smile plastered across his face. They were standing at the absolute peak of their arrogance. They truly believed they had reached the absolute summit of their social climbing mountain. The air in the room was thick with their overwhelming pride and their dangerously false sense of absolute security. It was the absolute perfect moment to strike. The higher they climbed, the harder the physical impact would be when they finally hit the concrete reality of my revenge. I took one final deep breath, letting the cold, calculating energy flow freely through my veins. I let go of my mother's hand and gave her a highly confident smile. I reached out and caught the eye of the head DJ who was standing up in the elevated sound booth across the massive room. He was an independent contractor I had personally hired and paid generously. He knew exactly who was signing his massive checks. I gave him a subtle but incredibly sharp nod. It was time to stop the music. It was time to take the microphone and burn this entire fake empire straight to the very ground. We stepped through the massive archway and re-entered the grand ballroom. My mother walked right beside me, holding her head high. She did not try to hide the dark wine stain on her dress anymore. Instead, she wore it proudly, like a battle scar. The posture she held was absolutely regal. For the first time in her life, she was not shrinking herself to make other people comfortable. She was not trying to blend into the velvet curtains or hide by the industrial trash bins. We moved through the outer edges of the party like two queens arriving to reclaim their stolen kingdom. I could feel the sheer power radiating from her, and it fueled my own absolute resolve. As we navigated past the lavish dessert tables, I discreetly raised my left hand and tapped the side of my designer clutch twice. It was a subtle, predetermined signal. Immediately, four men dressed in sharp black suits detached themselves from the shadows near the perimeter of the room. This was my private security team. I had hired them through a highly exclusive corporate protection agency several months ago, bypassing Marcus and his cheap event planners entirely. They reported strictly to me, and they were extremely well paid to follow my exact instructions without asking a single question. I watched out of the corner of my eye as the tall lead security officer smoothly walked over to the massive double doors at the main entrance. He casually reached out and pushed the heavy brass lock, sliding the thick deadbolt securely into place. The loud metallic click echoed softly beneath the loud sound of the jazz band. The other three guards quickly moved with military precision to secure the outdoor terrace exits and the side hallway doors. They stood with their hands clasped in front of them, blocking the exits with their imposing frames. Nobody in the ballroom even noticed what was happening. The wealthy elite were all too busy drinking expensive champagne and laughing at Trey's loud, obnoxious jokes. But I knew the absolute truth. The heavy doors were locked. The trap was completely sealed. Not a single person was going to leave this room until I was completely finished with them. I continued walking straight toward the elevated DJ booth positioned just behind the grand marble staircase. The crowd naturally parted for me as I moved. Perhaps it was the terrifyingly cold expression on my face, or the absolute unwavering confidence in my stride, but the wealthy guests instinctively stepped aside. I walked right past the group of local politicians who were still practically kissing Vivian's hand. I walked right past Chloe, who was currently showing off her diamond ring to a prominent venture capitalist. And I walked right past Marcus, who was busy pouring himself another glass of my expensive imported bourbon. None of them even noticed me walk by. They were completely blinded by their own massive egos and their false sense of total security. I reached the base of the small carpeted steps leading up to the sound booth. I gently squeezed my mother's hand and she gave me a firm nod, stepping to the side to give me an unobstructed path. She stood tall at the bottom of the stairs, acting as my silent anchor. The DJ saw me coming and gave me a quick professional nod. He knew I was the one signing his massive paycheck tonight. I walked up the 3 short steps and stepped behind the large mixing console. The DJ immediately stepped aside, handing me the sleek wireless microphone. He did not hesitate. He simply handed me the weapon and waited for my ultimate command. I gripped the cold metal microphone in my right hand. I looked out over the sea of 200 wealthy guests. The room was a massive, chaotic swirl of colorful designer gowns, sparkling diamond jewelry, and blinding crystal chandeliers. I took a deep breath, letting the cool air fill my lungs and solidify my icy focus. I raised my left hand and pointed a single finger directly at the DJ. He instantly hit the master kill switch on the heavy soundboard. The upbeat jazz music did not just fade out slowly, it was brutally cut off mid-note. The sudden deafening silence hit the massive ballroom like a physical shockwave. Hundreds of conversations stopped abruptly. People froze with their crystal champagne glasses halfway to their mouths. The loud, boisterous laughter that had filled the luxurious room just a second ago was completely wiped out. Heads turned in total confusion, searching for the source of the sudden dramatic interruption. I stood perfectly still on the elevated platform, looking down at the massive, wealthy crowd. I waited for exactly 10 seconds, letting the uncomfortable, heavy silence stretch out and completely suffocate the room. I wanted them to feel the sudden, drastic shift in power. I wanted Marcus and his toxic family to feel the exact moment their arrogant celebration died. The atmosphere in the room completely transformed from a lavish high society party into a tense, silent courtroom. Slowly, I saw Vivian, head snapped toward the DJ booth. Her fake aristocratic smile immediately faltered as her eyes locked onto me. She looked highly annoyed, as if an unruly servant had just interrupted her royal coronation. Marcus turned around a second later, his brow furrowing in deep confusion. He took a heavy step toward the booth, opening his mouth to reprimand me for ruining his perfect night. Chloe and Trey stopped laughing and stared at me with pure, venomous contempt. They all thought I was just having an emotional breakdown. They genuinely thought I was going to throw a hysterical temper tantrum and embarrass myself in front of the elite society they so desperately worshipped. I raised the microphone to my lips. I did not shout, I did not scream. I spoke in a calm, steady, and incredibly authoritative voice that echoed clearly through the massive, silent ballroom. "Good evening, everyone," I said, offering the confused crowd a completely serene smile. "I apologize for the sudden interruption to the music, but I promise you this will be well worth your valuable time." A low murmur rippled through the sea of guests. I saw my lead venture capitalist cross his arms, looking up at me with keen professional interest. He recognized my corporate tone. He knew this was not a sweet, sentimental social speech. This was the precise tone I used right before a hostile corporate takeover. Mother Vivian just gave a beautiful, inspiring speech about the vital importance of family legacy and generational wealth. I continued, keeping my eyes locked dead onto Vivian's pale face. She spoke so passionately about the incredible financial future of my husband Marcus and the massive trust fund that is supposedly funding his new independent investment firm. It was truly a moving theatrical performance. Vivienne visibly stiffened, her manicured hands gripping the edge of the marble staircase railing. Marcus took another aggressive step forward, his face flushing deep red with rising panic. "Nia, put the microphone down right now," he hissed, his voice barely carrying over the quiet crowd. "You are going to ruin absolutely everything." I completely ignored his pathetic, cowardly command. I smiled even wider, a cold, terrifying smile that made Chloe physically take a stumbling step backward. Since we are all in such a generous sharing mood tonight, I decided it was only fair that I contribute to the grand celebration. I announced, my voice ringing with absolute, undeniable power. "You see, I am not just the woman paying for every single drop of premium champagne you are currently drinking. I am also the proud founder and CEO of a highly successful financial technology firm. So naturally, I have a very special financial announcement to share as well." The entire room held its collective breath. The silence was absolute. I reached into the hidden pocket of my silk dress and slowly pulled out my sleek black iPad. The corporate demolition was officially underway. I tapped the glowing screen of my iPad twice, initiating a wireless connection to the smart home theater system I had personally installed throughout the estate. At the far end of the grand ballroom, the massive 100-inch flat-screen television that had been playing a continuous loop of our beautiful wedding photos suddenly went entirely black. A split second later, my custom financial presentation flashed onto the enormous screen. The stark white background and sharp black text of official corporate documents illuminated the darkened room. A collective gasp erupted from the audience as hundreds of wealthy guests strained their necks to read the massive letters projected across the wall. I turned my attention directly to Chloe. She was standing near the lavish dessert table, her fingers gripping the edge of the white tablecloth so tightly her knuckles were completely white. I pressed a button on my screen, advancing the slide. A highly detailed financial spreadsheet appeared on the television, displaying a massive sea of negative red numbers. Next to it was an official majority shareholder agreement, bearing the official seal of the state. Earlier this evening, Chloe was kind enough to offer my mother some career advice. I said, my voice projecting with lethal clarity over the silent crowd. She told my mother she belonged in the kitchen washing dishes because she lacked the proper class to be in this room. Chloe loves to present herself to all of you as a brilliant, self-made female entrepreneur. She boasts about her luxury boutique chain at the country club and uses her supposed wealth to look down on hardworking people. But the documents currently displayed on that screen tell the absolute truth, I announced, pointing directly at the massive television. Those are the official corporate ledgers for Chloe's boutique chain. For the last 24 months, her business has been operating at a massive, catastrophic loss. Last year, she was on the verge of total bankruptcy. Her primary investors fled, her suppliers halted all shipments due to unpaid invoices, and she was weeks away from facing total corporate liquidation. The wealthy socialites who had been praising Chloe just an hour ago were now reading the projected bank statements in absolute horror. The screen displayed her desperate emails begging vendors for extensions and the maxed-out limits of her corporate credit cards. Chloe let out a high-pitched, frantic sound like a trapped animal. "Turn that off!" she screamed, her voice cracking with pure panic. She looked around wildly at the judging faces of the elite guests. "Those are fake. She is making all of this up to embarrass me. Trey, do something. Make her stop." Trey took a sudden, aggressive step forward, his face red with anger, but the lead security guard I had stationed near the terrace doors immediately shifted his weight, placing a heavy hand on his belt. Trey froze instantly, his cowardly nature taking over. He looked up at the screen, reading the detailed financial documents, and his jaw dropped. He had absolutely no idea how bad his wife's business actually was. She had been lying to him too. "I am not making anything up, Chloe," I said smoothly, tapping my screen one more time. The slide transitioned to a massive blown-up image of the final signature page of a corporate buyout contract. When your investors abandoned you, a private proxy firm swooped in and purchased 60% of your outstanding shares. They injected just enough capital to keep your doors open and your fragile ego intact. I took a slow, deep breath, letting the absolute weight of my next words crush the remaining life out of her fake persona. "I am the sole owner of that proxy firm, Chloe. I own 60% of your entire company. I am your majority shareholder. Every single designer dress you wear, every expensive vacation you take, and every drop of premium wine you intentionally pour on innocent women is funded entirely by my charity. You are not a boss. You are my employee." Chloe began to shake violently. Her perfectly manicured facade was completely shattered. "No!" she gasped, shaking her head frantically as she backed away from the crowd. "You cannot do this. You have no right to do this to me. I have every legal right." I corrected her, my voice turning completely cold and merciless. "And according to Section 4 of the operating agreement you just read, I have the absolute unchecked authority to terminate the managing director at any time for any reason with zero severance pay. Chloe, as of this exact second, you are officially fired." The entire ballroom erupted in loud, shocked whispers. "You are permanently banned from entering any of the boutique locations," I continued, raising my voice to cut through the noise. "The locks are being changed as we speak. Starting tomorrow morning, my legal team will begin the aggressive liquidation of all remaining company inventory to recoup my financial investment. Your business is gone, Chloe. You have absolutely nothing left." Chloe let out a blood-curdling scream that echoed off the high ceilings. She lunged forward, trying to run toward the DJ booth to stop me, but her expensive high heel caught the edge of the marble floor, and she stumbled, falling hard to her knees. She knelt there in the middle of the grand ballroom, crying hysterically, her perfect blonde hair falling in messy, tangled strands across her tear-stained face. The arrogant Karen persona had completely evaporated, replaced by the raw, pathetic reality of a woman who had just lost everything she valued in the world. She looked up at the wealthy women she had spent years desperately trying to impress, begging them for help with her tear-filled eyes. But the elite crowd did not offer her a single ounce of sympathy. In their ruthless world, financial fraud and lying about your wealth was the ultimate unforgivable sin. The powerful socialites actively stepped away from her, pulling their expensive gowns close to their bodies as if her poverty was a contagious disease. Whispers of fraud and bankrupt rippled through the crowd, completely destroying any remaining shred of her social reputation. She had tried to put my mother in her place by ruining a $50 handmade dress. In return, I had permanently ruined her entire life. I looked down at her sobbing figure, feeling absolutely no pity. I pressed the button on my iPad to load the next slide. The corporate execution was only 1/3 of the way complete. Vivian could not stand the silence. She could not stand seeing her perfect aristocratic family completely humiliated in front of her high society friends. As Chloe continued to sob hysterically on the marble floor, the matriarch of the family finally snapped. She marched forward, her heavy emerald green gown sweeping aggressively across the floor. Her face was twisted into a mask of pure, desperate fury. She pointed a shaking, manicured finger directly at the DJ booth where I was standing. "Nia, stop this absolute madness right now!" she shrieked, her voice completely losing its refined, aristocratic polish. "How dare you humiliate my daughter-in-law in front of our esteemed guests? You are acting like a completely unhinged, classless woman. We brought you into our prestigious family, and this is how you repay us. You are nothing but a jealous, bitter girl who will never understand true legacy or social grace. You need to turn that screen off, apologize to Chloe, and go back to the kitchen with your mother where you belong." I slowly shifted my gaze from the crying blonde woman on the floor to the angry matriarch standing at the bottom of the stairs. I did not blink. I did not flinch. The venom in her words meant absolutely nothing to me anymore because I held the ultimate power over her entire existence. True legacy. Vivian. I asked, my voice echoing loudly and sharply through the silent ballroom. Is that what you call drowning in millions of dollars of undisclosed debt while begging your son to pay your country club dues? I tapped the screen of my iPad again. The massive television behind me flashed brightly, and Chloe's disastrous corporate records were instantly replaced by a set of incredibly official legal documents. The heavy gold seal of the state bank was displayed prominently at the very top of the paperwork. Next to the bank records was the high-resolution photograph of the Savannah mansion that Trey had so proudly displayed on the wooden easel just minutes ago. You stood on those stairs earlier tonight and bragged about your generational wealth, I said, pointing directly at the massive glowing screen. You claimed that the beautiful Savannah estate was the historic crown jewel of your family. You used that house to mock my hardworking mother and tell her she was not worthy to breathe the same air as you. But you conveniently forgot to tell your elite friends the actual truth about that magnificent property. I gestured to the right side of the screen, where massive red foreclosure stamps were highly visible across the paperwork. The documents currently projected behind me are official bank foreclosure notices, I announced, my voice steady and completely devoid of mercy. 8 months ago, the bank legally seized the Savannah mansion because you had secretly taken out 3 separate mortgages to fund your lavish shopping habits, and you defaulted on every single one of them. You have not made a legitimate mortgage payment in nearly 2 years, Vivian. You do not have a family trust fund. You do not have an ancestral endowment. You are completely, utterly bankrupt. The collective gasp from the elite crowd was deafening. The wealthy politicians and socialites who had just applauded her grand speech were now staring at the screen with their mouths wide open in absolute horror. In the ruthless world of the old money elite, financial ruin was the ultimate unforgivable crime. But faking your wealth and lying to the entire community was a complete social death sentence. Vivian turned a sickly shade of gray. Her hand flew up to her chest, desperately clutching her expensive pearl necklace, as if it could physically protect her from the truth. That is a lie, she stammered, looking frantically at the politicians she had been trying to impress just moments ago. That is a forged document. The family trust fund paid off those loans. I have an anonymous wealthy buyer who secured the estate for our family. She is trying to frame me. I laughed, a cold, sharp sound that cut right through her pathetic, frantic lies. You do have an anonymous buyer, Vivian. I agreed, tapping the iPad to highlight the final signature page of the massive property deed. The screen instantly zoomed in on the name of the purchasing company. It clearly read Shirley Investments in bold black text. I named my private real estate holding company after my beautiful mother, I told her, my voice dropping to a dangerous absolute whisper that carried across the dead silent room. Shirley Investments bought that historic mansion straight from the bank in pure, unadulterated cash. You do not own a single brick of that house, Vivian. I own it. My mother owns it. Vivian stopped breathing. Her eyes widened to the size of saucers as she stared at my mother's name projected in massive letters across the television screen. For the past 8 months, you have been living rent-free in a house that belongs entirely to the very same woman you just tried to banish to the catering kitchen. I continued, delivering the final absolute blow. Every time you walked through those grand front doors, every time you slept in that master bedroom, you were living off the silent charity of a retired hospital janitor. You are not royalty, Vivian. You are a highly arrogant squatter. The absolute pure disgust on the faces of the aristocratic guests was undeniable. The elite circle literally physically backed away from Vivian. They looked at her as if she was covered in toxic waste. The wealthy politicians she had spent years kissing up to immediately turned their backs on her, whispering harshly to their wives about her massive, embarrassing fraud. The high society women who had previously sneered at my mother's homemade dress were now glaring at Vivian with absolute unmasked contempt. She was completely stripped bare, exposed as a desperate broke fraud, living entirely off the charity of the daughter-in-law she constantly abused. I am officially terminating your fake charity tonight, I announced smoothly, looking down at her trembling, pathetic figure. You have exactly 48 hours to pack up whatever cheap knockoff clothes you actually own and vacate my property. If you are still inside my historic Savannah mansion by Monday morning, the county sheriff will be there to physically throw you and your belongings onto the street. Your fake aristocratic reign is officially over. Vivian stared at the massive glowing letters of my mother's name on the screen. The absolute finality of the eviction notice seemed to physically crush the air out of her lungs. She looked around, desperately seeking a single sympathetic face among the crowd of wealthy politicians and socialites. But she found absolutely nothing except cold, calculating judgment. Realizing she had absolutely zero leverage left and no lies left to spin, she resorted to her oldest and most pathetic manipulation tactic. She placed the back of her manicured hand against her forehead, let out a loud theatrical gasp, and dramatically collapsed toward the marble floor. She expected a crowd of concerned guests to rush forward and catch her. She expected her elite friends to gather around her and offer smelling salts. But nobody moved a single muscle. The elite guests literally parted like the Red Sea, allowing her to hit the hard, polished marble with a loud, uncomfortable thud. She lay there with her eyes squeezed shut, waiting for the sympathetic gasps that never came. The sheer embarrassment of her fake fainting spell was almost worse than the financial exposure. Several prominent women actually rolled their eyes and stepped entirely away from her motionless body. Even Marcus remained frozen in place, completely paralyzed by the massive destruction of his entire world. But Trey did not freeze. Trey was a man who had always relied on physical intimidation and loud aggression to mask his profound insecurities. He looked at his crying wife on the floor, his pathetic mother faking a medical emergency, and the massive television screen broadcasting their absolute failure. His face turned a dangerous shade of crimson. He let out a furious, animalistic roar and lunged directly toward the DJ booth. "You ruined us!" he screamed, his fists balled tightly at his sides, his eyes wide with unhinged rage. "I will kill you, Nia. I will tear you apart." He did not even make it 3 steps. Before Trey could even reach the first step of the elevated platform, a massive shadow intercepted him. The lead security guard I had stationed near the terrace moved with terrifying military speed. He stepped smoothly into Trey's path, grabbed him firmly by the lapels of his expensive maroon suit, and slammed him violently backward. Trey hit the nearest dessert table with incredible force. A massive towering pyramid of crystal champagne flutes shattered into thousands of tiny pieces, raining down on him as the guard pinned his chest firmly against the white tablecloth. Trey thrashed wildly, struggling against the iron grip of the security officer, but 2 more guards immediately rushed forward from the exits. They grabbed Trey's arms, twisting them securely behind his back and forcing his face down into a silver platter of expensive macarons. "Let me go!" Trey yelled violently, spitting cake crumbs and champagne across the polished floor. "You cannot do this to me! Do you have any idea who I am? I will sue you!" I stepped right up to the absolute edge of the elevated platform, looking down at his pathetic, struggling form. "We know exactly who you are, Trey," I said, my voice projecting clearly over his frantic, pathetic shouting. "You are a broke, failed businessman who uses my hard-earned money to cover up your massive incompetence. You are nothing but a loud, aggressive coward who attacks women because you have absolutely zero real power in this world." The sheer brutality of the physical takedown combined with the absolute financial exposure completely shattered whatever remaining illusion of power this toxic family held. The aristocratic facade they had spent decades carefully constructing was entirely stripped bare in a matter of minutes. They were no longer the elite royalty of Atlanta. They were just a group of broke, desperate fraudsters pinned to tables and crying on the floor. I looked out at the wealthy crowd to witness the absolute fallout. The high society people who had been enthusiastically applauding Vivian just 10 minutes ago were now actively turning their backs on the entire family. State senators and wealthy tech investors were pulling out their smartphones, typing furious text messages to their respective social circles to distance themselves from the fraud. The news of this massive, unprecedented scandal was already spreading like a wildfire through the highly exclusive high society networks of the city. By tomorrow morning, Vivian, Chloe, and Trey would be permanently blacklisted from every single country club, charity gala, and elite organization in the state. The total social destruction was truly breathtaking to witness. I had not just taken their money, I had completely annihilated their social currency, which was the absolute only thing they actually valued. I looked down at my mother, who was standing tall and incredibly proud near the grand staircase. She watched the miserable family that had abused and belittled her absolutely crumble under the massive weight of their own arrogance. She gave me a small, satisfied smile, her dark eyes shining with vindication. But the corporate execution was not entirely finished. There was still one person left standing amidst the absolute wreckage. There was still one ultimate parasite left to address. I slowly turned my cold gaze away from the struggling Trey and the faking Vivian and locked my eyes directly onto my husband Marcus. Marcus stood completely frozen at the bottom of the grand staircase. The smug, arrogant grin he had worn all night had entirely melted away, leaving behind a pale mask of absolute terror. He looked at his mother faking a medical emergency on the floor. He looked at his brother Trey, who was still firmly pinned against a shattered dessert table by my security guards. And then he looked at the massive television screen that was currently broadcasting their absolute financial ruin to every single elite guest in the room. His breathing became shallow and erratic. He was the golden child of his toxic family, the supposedly brilliant investment banker who was destined to build an empire. But in a matter of minutes, I had completely dismantled his entire universe. He took a shaky step toward the elevated DJ booth, his hands held out in a pathetic gesture of surrender. "Nia, sweetheart." He began, his voice trembling, as he tried to put on his best manipulative husband voice. "Let us just calm down. You have made your point. You are angry, and I understand that, but we do not need to do this in front of all these people. We are a team. We are legally married. Let us just go upstairs and talk about this privately like rational adults." I stared down at him, feeling absolutely nothing but cold, hard disgust. "We are not a team, Marcus," I said, my voice projecting clearly over the silent ballroom, "and we are certainly not having a private conversation. You had no problem turning your back on my mother when she was being publicly humiliated. You stood there and laughed with your banking friends while your sister-in-law told my mother to go wash dishes in the kitchen. You wanted an audience tonight to celebrate your fake wealth. So we are going to finish this right here in front of everyone." The rejection hit him like a physical blow. The pathetic, pleading look on his face instantly vanished completely, replaced by the vicious, entitled arrogance I had grown to despise. His true colors finally bled through. He straightened his custom velvet jacket and glared up at me, his eyes narrowing with venomous greed. "You think you can just publicly embarrass my family and walk away from me?" he shouted, his voice echoing aggressively through the massive room. "You think just because you have some tech money, you can dictate the terms of my life? I am your husband, Nia. I am your legal spouse. You cannot just throw me out on the street. Everything you built over the last 5 years was built during our marriage. That makes it marital property." He turned around, looking at the crowd of wealthy guests desperately trying to rally support from the other businessmen in the room. "Half of everything she owns belongs to me," he declared, wildly pointing a finger back at me. "I know my legal rights. I want my cut, Nia. If you want to end this marriage, fine. But I am taking half of your software company. I am taking half of this $12 million mansion. I am taking half of your investment portfolios. You are going to write me a massive check, and I will walk out of here a multimillionaire. You cannot escape the law. Actually, Marcus, you are the one who is desperately trying to escape the law." The voice did not belong to me. It came from the dense crowd of guests standing near the front of the stage. The sea of wealthy socialites parted smoothly, revealing a stunning, highly powerful black woman stepping forward into the light. It was my lead corporate attorney, Ms. Sterling. She was dressed in an impeccably tailored navy blue power suit, holding a thick black leather portfolio in her hands. She possessed the kind of commanding, intimidating presence that commanded absolute respect in every single courtroom she entered. Marcus blinked in confusion, taking a step back as Ms. Sterling walked deliberately toward the center of the room. He recognized her. He knew she was one of the most ruthless and expensive litigators in the entire state of Georgia. "Who invited you to my house?" Marcus demanded, trying to sound authoritative but failing miserably. "This is a private family matter. This is not your house, Marcus," Miss Sterling replied, her voice sharp and completely devoid of emotion. "And this stopped being a private family matter the exact second you decided to commit a massive corporate felony." She stopped right in front of him, slowly unzipping her heavy leather portfolio. The entire ballroom leaned in, the wealthy guests absolutely captivated by the legal execution unfolding right before their eyes. Ms. Sterling pulled out a thick stack of legal documents printed on heavy watermarked paper. She casually tossed the entire stack directly at Marcus. The papers hit his chest and fluttered down onto the polished marble floor, scattering around his expensive leather shoes. Marcus looked down at the documents, his eyes widening as he recognized the bold legal heading on the very first page. "That is the original prenuptial agreement you signed 5 years ago," Ms. Sterling explained, projecting her voice so the elite crowd could hear every single devastating word. "You were so incredibly eager to secure your lavish lifestyle that you barely even read the fine print before signing it. If you had bothered to read it, you would know that it contains a highly specific ironclad morality and financial fraud clause. It clearly states that any act of embezzlement, theft, or gross financial deception completely voids your right to any alimony, spousal support, or division of marital assets. I have never stolen a single dime from my wife." Marcus shouted, his face turning bright red as he looked frantically around the room at his senior banking partners. "My banking partners know my character. I am a professional. This is a complete lie designed to cheat me out of my legal settlement." Miss Sterling did not even flinch at his aggressive outburst. She simply reached into her portfolio and pulled out a single sheet of paper. It was a high-resolution, printed bank statement. She held it up so the surrounding businessmen could clearly see the massive numbers printed on it. "On October 14th of this year, you secretly authorized a wire transfer of exactly $500,000 from a joint investment account," Ms. Sterling stated, her tone completely clinical and merciless. "You routed those funds through 3 separate offshore holding accounts before depositing the entire sum into a shell corporation registered to your brother Trey." Marcus physically recoiled as if he had just been shot. The color completely drained from his face, leaving him looking like a terrified ghost. He looked at the bank statement in Ms. Sterling's hand, and his jaw dropped in absolute horror. He had spent weeks covering his digital tracks, believing he was a financial genius who could outsmart my accounting software. He had absolutely no idea I had been tracking his theft since the very first day. "You utilized your professional position as a banker to bypass the standard security protocols on that joint account." Ms. Sterling continued driving the final nail into his coffin. "That constitutes deliberate financial fraud, wire fraud, and felony embezzlement. You stole $500,000 from your wife to bail out your brother's failing company. You violated the prenuptial agreement, Marcus. You breached your fiduciary duty." The wealthy bankers standing near the bar stared at Marcus with absolute disgust. In the financial sector, stealing money was the ultimate career death sentence. His senior partners were already whispering to each other, undoubtedly preparing to fire him the second they walked out of the building. His entire professional reputation was completely annihilated in less than 60 seconds. "So let me be incredibly clear," Ms. Sterling said, stepping closer to him, her dark eyes flashing with legal authority. "You are not getting half of the tech company. You are not getting half of this mansion. You are not getting a single dime of spousal support. You legally forfeit absolutely everything. You are walking out of this marriage with nothing but the clothes currently on your back." Marcus started to hyperventilate, his chest heaving as the massive reality of his situation crushed down on him. He looked up at me standing in the DJ booth, tears of pure panic welling in his eyes. "Nia, please," he begged, his voice cracking into a pathetic whimper. "You cannot do this. We can fix this. I will pay the money back. Please do not take everything away from me. I have nothing without you." I looked down at the man I used to love, feeling absolutely nothing but a profound sense of liberation. "You never loved me, Marcus," I told him, my voice cold and absolute. "You loved the power my money gave you. You loved the false reality you built on my back. But that reality is officially over." Ms. Sterling reached into her portfolio one last time and pulled out a crisp manila envelope. She shoved it aggressively into his chest, forcing him to take it. "Those are your official divorce papers," Ms. Sterling said sharply. "They were filed electronically with the Superior Court this afternoon. My client has already signed them. I suggest you find a very cheap lawyer, Marcus, because you are going to need one when the criminal fraud investigation begins on Monday morning." Ms. Sterling turned sharply on her heel, completely dismissing him, and walked over to stand respectfully by my mother's side, near the staircase. The legal execution was flawless. Marcus stood alone in the center of the massive ballroom, holding his divorce papers, his hands shaking violently. He was completely broken. I leaned into the microphone one final time. I looked at Marcus. I looked at the sobbing Chloe. I looked at the pinned Trey. And I looked at the faking Vivian. The entire Parasite family was completely neutralized. "This anniversary party is officially over," I announced, my voice ringing with total, absolute authority. "The doors will be unlocked in exactly 5 minutes. You have exactly 5 minutes to get the hell out of my house before my security team physically drags you out into the street." The 5 minutes passed in absolute agonizing silence for the toxic family standing in the center of my ballroom. The elite guests did not offer them a single word of comfort. When the grandfather clock in the hallway chimed, my lead security guard gave a sharp nod to his team. The heavy brass deadbolts on the main doors were pulled back, echoing loudly in the quiet room. It was time for the trash to be taken out. Trey was the first to go. Two massive guards hauled him up from the shattered dessert table and physically frog-marched him toward the exit. He kicked and cursed, but it was completely useless against their trained strength. They tossed him out onto the front steps like a discarded rag doll. Chloe followed closely behind him. She was limping heavily, having broken the heel off her expensive designer shoe during her fall. Her mascara was running down her face in thick, dark streaks, ruining her perfect blonde aesthetic. She did not even look back. She just kept her head down, rushing out into the cold night air to escape the piercing, judgmental stares of the high society women she used to call her peers. Then came Vivian. The grand matriarch who had entered the party believing she was the undisputed queen of Atlanta was now reduced to a shuffling, broken old woman. Nobody rushed to offer her an arm to lean on. The local politicians and wealthy socialites actively turned their backs, pretending she did not even exist. She stumbled toward the open doors, her emerald green sequined gown dragging sadly across the marble floor. She looked entirely pathetic, stripped of her lies and her fake generational wealth. Finally, Marcus walked toward the exit. He moved slowly, his shoulders slumped, completely defeated. Just before he crossed the threshold, he stopped and looked back at me one last time. I stood on the elevated platform, looking down at him with a face carved from solid ice. There was no love left in my eyes. There was no pity. There was only the cold, hard reality that he had made a catastrophic choice and was now paying the ultimate price. He swallowed hard, looking down at the divorce papers trembling in his hands before stepping out into the dark driveway. The heavy oak doors swung shut behind him, closing with a loud, definitive boom that finalized my absolute freedom. The parasite was gone. The air in the ballroom instantly felt lighter and easier to breathe. The suffocating tension evaporated. I stepped down from the DJ booth and signaled the band to resume playing. A smooth, elegant jazz melody filled the room once again, and the wealthy guests slowly returned to their conversations, though I knew my name would be spoken with absolute reverence in elite circles for decades to come. I walked over to the private mahogany bar near the garden terrace. I selected a fresh bottle of my most expensive imported vintage wine and carefully poured 2 glasses. I picked them up and walked back to the velvet alcove where my mother was waiting. She was standing tall, her eyes bright with unshed tears of pure pride. I handed her a crystal glass and gently clinked mine against it. We did not need to say a word. The sound of the crystal ringing in the air was a perfect toast to our new beginning. As I looked at my mother smiling, despite the dark wine stain on her handmade dress, I realized the true magnitude of what we had accomplished tonight. Society constantly tries to tell women that our ultimate worth is tied to the men we marry or the elite families we marry into. They tell us we should shrink ourselves, endure toxic abuse, and swallow our pride just to keep a perfectly curated image intact. But that is the biggest lie ever sold to us. True power comes from absolute financial independence. It comes from the quiet, relentless hustle of building your own empire brick by brick so that no arrogant man and no fake aristocratic family can ever hold your livelihood hostage. I built my wealth from the ground up, and because of that, I had the power to protect the woman who gave me life. My mother scrubbed hospital floors until her hands bled so I could stand in boardrooms. She sacrificed her own body to build the foundation of my success. Anyone who thinks they can insult the architect of my life and walk away unpunished is completely delusional. The price of disrespecting a hardworking mother is absolute destruction. I took their money, their social status, and their fake legacy, and I burned it all to ashes. I walked away from a toxic marriage, not as a victim, but as the sole owner of my entire destiny. Never let anyone make you feel small in a room you paid for. Never let anyone disrespect the people who loved you when you had nothing. Build your empire, protect your peace, and always remember exactly who you are.